I am the solution owner of something called the Foresight model. The Foresight model is a predictive analytics machine learning tool that's used to predict where displaced populations are going, how they're getting there, so that we can better support them, so we can proactively support populations in crisis. So that's a lot of words to say we're using AI to predict a refugee crisis. And it all started with an idea. So what I would like to share with you guys is a little bit about my experiences that led up to the development of the solution. I want to talk for a moment about ideas, in particular, what do we do with ideas? And then lastly, share some lessons learned that I hope can be helpful for you on your own journey. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. And when I was a kid, I was a big daydreamer. I was very distracted in school. I had a lot of imaginary friends. When I was 9 years old, in fourth grade, my fourth grade teacher gave me a gift. He gave me a book called The Fourth Grade Wizards. I still have it. And this book was about a girl named Marianne, and she was a daydreamer, and she was very distracted in school, and she really wanted to be a part of a group called the Wizards. And the Wizards got to do special projects for the teachers, and they got special privileges. And I'm mentioning this because it's the first time really that I can remember daydreaming being validated by an authority figure in my life, and sort of seen as something that was okay and perhaps even important. Spoiler alert: she makes it to the Wizards. I don't know if anybody was gonna go get that book, but she does. Fast forward a few years to 2011, and there are a few things, 3 things specifically that happened that year that changed my life forever. Number 1, my second son, Zane, was born, who is now 12. Number 2, my grandfather passed away. And number 3, what would become the war in Syria started. So I am a first-generation Syrian American. Both of my parents are from Syria. All of my extended family, going back many, many generations, are all from Syria. So when the violence escalated and it was impacting millions of people, my family were among them. Neighbors of theirs were killed. My grandfather's business was torn down. And something that would happen pretty often, actually, that was particularly distressing for me is they would lose power, which is quite common during a conflict, right? They would lose electricity. And during these blackout periods, right, we couldn't contact them, could not make sure that they were okay, and my imagination would sort of come back online. And I would just imagine all of the horrible things that could possibly be happening to them. And so after one of these blackout periods, I was speaking with my aunt, and I begged her to leave. I said, just take my cousins, just take the kids and go. And I'll never forget what she said. She said that she couldn't leave because my cousin had an orthodontist appointment. And there are 2 things that I realized in that moment. Number 1, it was really unfair what I was asking her to do, right? I didn't have any understanding of the gravity of what it meant to just pick up and leave and not know when you were gonna come back. Number 2, I realized that the reasons that people stay or that people leave are so much different than I ever thought. But as we now know, right, the violence did continue to escalate, both in terms of scope and intensity, and things did get to the point where they started to more seriously consider leaving. And when that happened, my mother asked if there was anything I could do to help. Now, I have a background in communications. So why my mother thought that I was the right person to help, I'm not sure. But she's my mom, and of course, I said yes. And I had no idea where to begin, so I just started learning. I started learning about what the options were and what are the choices available for civilians in conflict. I started digging in and I started learning that there really weren't many, right? The choices seemed to be they could, number one, go to a refugee camp. Number two, stay home, manage the risks as they had been doing. Or number three, they could apply for a visa, some of which could take many years. I called my congressman's office and we were kind of continuing to explore this idea of a visa. And she said, well, an immigrant visa could take about 10 years. Tourist visa is the fastest way out, but that's really for people to come see the Washington Monument, right? Not to escape a war. And so I asked, well, what kind of visa is for escaping a war? We'll just do that. And she said, well, it doesn't exist, but maybe you could petition Congress. So did not seem like something we had the time to do. So we decided to go ahead and apply for the tourist visa. And at that point, our job was to just garner as much support as possible in support of their application. So by the end of this process, I had reached out to 7 immigration lawyers, the UN, the UNHCR, the House of Representatives, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I got as far as the Secretary of State. We had a signed letter from John Kerry. And at this point, it's starting to make more sense why a background in communications was helpful. And then it's the day of the interview. And I remember I could not sleep that night, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, I hear my mother come up the stairs, and very matter-of-factly, she tells me it was denied. And I asked why, and she said the only explanation that we were given was that it was not the result of any outside influence. And I remember feeling just devastated. I remember feeling very much like a failure, like I had let down everyone in my family who at that time were on their way back to Syria, that I had let down everybody who tried to help us. And for a while, I didn't do anything. I felt like there was nothing left for me to do. And at the time, I was working rewind. So I felt that there was nothing really left for me to do. And of course, at this time, the war just continues to rage on, right? And so this was the time that we're reading about refugees putting their kids in rafts to escape. And when they were asked why, they said it was because they didn't have a better choice, right? That the water was safer than the land. And I knew that the reason they didn't have a better choice is because we weren't giving them one. It wasn't the war that was keeping people in, it was the rest of the world that was keeping them out. And I was working at a global IT firm at the time, and I wanted to quit. My heart just wasn't in it. And one day I got an email. And the subject of this email was how big data is transforming the cheese-making industry. And I was incredibly frustrated and disappointed, although I do love cheese. But I was so frustrated that I knew that millions of people were losing their lives, and I knew that we were using AI to support businesses and to apparently transform the cheese-making industry. But it gave me an idea. What if we could take this technology and apply it to refugee crises, right? What if we could respond proactively and make sure that when people needed a safe way out, they had one? So I started socializing this idea with colleagues of mine who validated that it was a technically sound concept. And we built a prototype and it worked. Today, the Foresight model is operational in 26 countries. We're using over 120 indicators. We are predicting the total number of people displaced up to 3 years into the future. And my favorite part, our predictions are less than 10% of actual displacement figures, which are more accurate than what's currently being used in humanitarian response plans. So What do you do with an idea? It is the name of a children's book by Kobe Yamada. My kids have it, love it. And I've thought about this a lot, and for me, it boils down to 3 really simple things. Number 1, pay attention. I think too often we have these ideas, things occur to us, and we dismiss them. Ideas need time and attention to grow. Number 2, share it, which isn't entirely necessary, right? Sometimes we have ideas and we just want to keep them to ourselves, and that's fine. But assuming you ever want it to live outside the boundaries of your imagination, you are at some point going to have to share it, which is scary. But you have to put it out into the world and see what happens, good or bad. Number 3, believe in it. If you don't believe in it, nobody else will either. And when people challenge it, right, don't abandon your idea. Your job is to help people see it the way that you see it. And there's a part of me that wants to say, it's easier said than done, but I actually don't think that is true. I think that is the easy part. In fact, if anything, I think if it's an idea that you care about, it's harder not to do those things, right? It's energizing to talk about it, and it's fun to think about it. And when people challenge it, you want to defend it, and you want to help them see it the way that you see it. I think the harder part is in sort of the smaller steps along the way. And here's some of the things that I've learned in my journey. So number 1, daydreaming. Daydreaming, actually, I recently learned this, and I think it is so fascinating that daydreaming, they did a study, and they found that daydreaming enhances performance. So daydreaming is associated with the default network in our brains, right? The lower level functioning parts of our brains. And it used to be thought that it was sort of one or the other, right? You're either engaging the lower level parts of your brain or the higher level parts of your brain, which are associated with complex problem solving. But what they found is that when you're activating the lower level parts, when you're in that sort of self-hypnosis, your mind is relaxed state, you're activating the complex problem solving. And that's what we can attribute things like an aha moment or a eureka moment to, right? So now, sort of that inner child daydreaming part of me is still there, right? She still exists, and I just make sure that I have time to let my mind wander. Whenever I'm trying to figure something out, and the harder I try to figure it out, the more I think about it, the harder it is to figure out, which I kind of refer to that as like mental quicksand, right? I stop, I go for a run or do something to let my mind just relax, and I will always have some sort of clarity on the other side of that. So that's the first thing. I deliberately dream. Second thing, diversity. I learned about diversity and innovation, and inadvertently, I learned something about my own self-worth. For a long time, quite a long time actually, and sometimes even now, I felt very inadequate because I'm not a data scientist, I'm not an immigration lawyer, I'm not a researcher, I'm none of these things. But it occurred to me that the only reason I was able to see things in a particular way, the only reason I was able to recognize the gap that I did and how we could fix it is precisely for that reason, right? I don't have to be all of those things to have value. So I try to keep that in mind when imposter syndrome kicks in. Number 3, I learned to trust my future self. And here's what I mean by that. I recently gave a talk in Rome, and I had to explain the concept of hindsight being 20/20 because it's not a phrase that's common there. And I explained that sometimes you can only see things clearly looking backwards. At the time, I couldn't see how communications, refugees, technology, humanitarian policy, I couldn't see how any of those things were connected. But now, of course, it makes more sense, right? If I'm ever having a moment where I don't understand how things are connected or something just doesn't make sense to me quite yet, I try to just keep in mind be patient, right? Just wait longer. It'll make sense later, even if it doesn't right now. And then lastly, I learned about the difference between barriers and what I call like what now moments, right? So a barrier is something that for me feels like a failure, right? In the moment, it's some sort of challenge. It feels like a failure. But in reality, it's actually a growing pain, right? These are things that anytime I encountered a barrier, it made me think harder, made me work harder, right? It made the idea and the solution stronger on the other side. And I think of it more like a wall, right? You can see a path forward. You just have to figure out how to get to the other side. A what now moment is more like a black hole, right? If a barrier is like a wall. And in this black hole, right, you can't see a way forward. You're not sure that one exists, right? It's much more of a dark, hopeless kind of place. And you're also not embarrassed of failure. Or, I'm sorry, you're not afraid of embarrassment or failure, because whatever it is you were afraid of has probably already happened. But I learned that there's only one thing that needs to happen when you're in this moment, right? There's only one way to get out of it. And I'd like to share a quote that I absolutely love. Sometimes when you're in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but you've actually been planted. And that's Christine Kane. And so when you're in this moment, the only thing you have to do is make a choice. Are you buried or are you planted? And maybe what's been planted is the seed of a great idea. Thank you. The end.